Hi everyone, and welcome to my table for this week's table talk. We begin with John chapter 19 verses 17 through 20. Carrying his own cross, Jesus went out to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with two others, one on each side, and Jesus in the middle. Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Our line from the Apostles' Creed that we're going to be looking at this week is suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried. I pray that as we continue to meet around the table, you are finding God in more and more places in your life as you live your daily life, that you're just seeing and hearing and experiencing God more and more. This week, I really wanted to cover a larger portion of the Apostles' Creed. I wanted to take us all the way through our belief that Jesus died and to the line that says 3 days later, he rose. I really wanted to jump ahead to resurrection. But I also think that it's really important that we pause where we have today and remember that Jesus died and considered what Jesus' death means to you and I in our daily living as we seek to figure out how the Apostles' Creed impacts us in our daily lives in a practical way. Jesus' death means that not only does our God love us enough to leave heaven and to get messy like we talked about last week, but also that our God is willing to get messy enough in the stuff of humanity to face and experience death. If there were other gods, I imagine that they would laugh at our God and think, what is wrong with this God that he would want to live as a mortal, to suffer, to face death and all of its implications, and to die? Why would any other God do that? And what does it mean for you and for I? Every world religion that we know of acknowledges that there is a problem with humanity and with this earth. In fact, I think people that have no religion or belief think that there's something that's just not quite right with our world, especially if you watch the news. As Christians, we are able to identify that problem. We say that that problem that exists in the world is sin. Sin is simply anything that we think, say, or do that does not please God or breaks God's law. Think about the 10 Commandments when you think about God's law. When we lie, when we cheat, when we steal, when we're jealous of what other people have, and or when we hurt other people, we sin. And sin is a big problem. Our God knows that sin is a big problem for us. And as we already established, God's love for us is unfathomably great. So just like a good mom or dad wants to help their child when they have a problem, or a good spouse wants to help their husband or wife when they have a problem, or when a good person wants to help someone who has a need in their community, God wants to help humanity with sin. Only God's love is even greater than we can imagine, so God's desire to help with the problem of sin is even greater than our desire to help others. God's way of helping with sin, as we already said, was to get messy. Sin started with humanity, so it was going to take a human to conquer sin. And that human was God incarnate, which means God taking on the flesh of humanity, God becoming a person. And that human was Jesus. For sin to be conquered, sin had to die. Now, Jesus was the only person who never sinned. Jesus suffered, Jesus faced temptation, but Jesus never gave in to temptation. And then Jesus, who had never sinned, took on the burden of all of humanity's sin and took all of that sin to the cross and died. So what does this mean for you and for me as we live our day-to-day lives? When we face our own mortality or suffer grief as people that we love die, we do not walk through the valley of the shadow of death alone. God is with us. That comes from Psalm 23. Even more so than that, God is familiar with the valley. God has walked in this valley before. God wept when Lazarus died and felt the ache of grief. God walked towards Golgotha knowing that it was the end of his life. God experienced all the feelings of being a human being who is about to die. God knows what it is to face death and to feel sad for family and friends who are going to grieve for him. When we suffer, whether it be physically, mentally, emotionally, or even spiritually, God is one who understands that suffering because God is well acquainted with our suffering. So God comes and sits with us. not as one who is sympathetic, but as one who knows and understands, one who is empathetic. And when the pain is too great, we can talk to God about it. When we're afraid what death might be like or what it might mean for us and those that we love, we can talk to God about it. When our hearts shatter into a million pieces because of some great thing that has happened in our lives, we can talk to God about it. And not only can we talk to God about all of these things, but God will comfort us like no one else can comfort us because God knows. God knows our pain as intimately as we know our own pain. And God knows our fear and our grief as well as we know our own fear and our own grief. God can calm and reassure our souls because God has already faced down and experienced sorrow and suffering and death. Right now, at this moment, I really want to move on to the good news of God's victory. But friends, if any of us have ever suffered or sorrowed, we know that we can't just rush ahead. It takes time to get to the place of being able to hear the good news of victory. For now, it is enough to know that God sits with us in suffering, that God knows us and knows our suffering, and that God comforts us in our suffering. And God's comfort isn't a pithy saying or a trite condolence that may or may not be helpful. God's comfort is the very presence of God who knows our suffering and perhaps even knows our suffering better than we know it ourselves. So in the week ahead, when you face suffering and frustration, living in a world that is marked by sin, look and listen for God who sits with you in it. And when you encounter others who are suffering, whether it be great or small, seek to bring the presence of God with you into their lives, being instruments of God's peace. I look forward to seeing you next time around the table.